Hello, everyone. Welcome this morning in this webinar of the Consensus project, and it's all about policies about CCUS. Today, we are going to look into the future policies of CCUS. That's the title. And we chose this subject, and we are all glad that you are here in this webinar this early morning on Tuesday to discuss with us and to hear from us about what is going on in the CCUS carbon capture, utilization, and storage field of play at this moment in Europe. Sometimes we refer only to the CCU part, where we use our carbons to utilize in different ways. Sometimes we refer to the CCS part, where we want to store carbons away out of the atmosphere and underground. But we address this a bit in a mix, and we call it CCUS, so carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And we will highlight when we are focusing on one of them in particular. So CCUS is playing a big role nowadays in reaching climate targets. But how are we going to do this? Because this field is, well, apart from a couple of years ago, but a bit dormant in the last decade, but it now is rising rapidly. And how are we going to do this? How are we going to work in this field? Well, today we will have a look at current policies and in developing policies that are underway. We discussed this with our panelists, which I will introduce to you shortly. You can see them on the screen already. And hopefully in the end, this will give you a bit of an overview on the CCUS policies, but also on the state of play of CCUS technologies and the general field of CCUS in Europe. So a lot is going on nowadays, and there are already some policies out there. For example, the Net Zero Industry Act, which is the first one that actively is giving some obligations, for example, to storage owners, oil and gas companies producing oil and gas need to provide also room for CO2 storage. There was a public consultation out there for the European climate strategy for 2040, where CCUS was also asked as a topic to react on. And just after summer, we ended the call for evidence for, I have to look here, for the carbon management strategy that is into development and sees the light in 2024. Well, all relevant policies for shaping the carbon market. We at ConsenCUS are a Horizon 2020 funded project with a minor role, so to say. We are developing an innovative technique that can capture and convert carbon into useful products. But with ConsenCUS, we also are targeting and modeling our CO2 value chains, our CO2 clusters, industrial clusters. And with the help of the experts, which we will introduce shortly, we're going to talk on some of these developments. Okay, now this is also my first time in Webinar Geek, but I hope that the slides will now somehow move. We prepared this agenda for you. We're going to introduce the panelists. Then we give a short wrap-up of what is the ConsenCUS project and what's in the policy letter that ConsenCUS wrote, as also input for call for evidence. Then we go to our panel, and then we have room to answer questions. Some housekeeping rules. We are with a big group of 90 people attending this webinar, so thank you all for joining again. You can reach out to us by putting questions in the chat. There's a public chat for these questions. If there is some more irrelevant or more personal question, you can also use the private chat to do this. and that's the interaction part. Well, hopefully you will enjoy this policy talk about CCUS, and I will now going to introduce our panelists. And I would like to start with Eva Tamme. She is the chair of the Zero Emission Platform. The Zero Emission Platform is established under the SET plan, and it brings together all relevant parties from industries to the NGO side on talking about the development of CCUS technologies and how to deploy them and how to reach them, how to give them a good starting point. And Eva is also owner of an advice company, Climate Principles, also in the board of Pure Earth and advisory board of Carbon Gap, but the main focus will now be zero emission platform. So Eve, to start off and to hear your voice, Eva, sorry, to start off and hear your voice also, what was 2023 like for CCUS policies? Busy year?
Hello and good morning, everyone. Indeed, my name is Eva Tamme, and I'm here today talking in my capacity as the chair of Zero Emissions Platform. So first and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation. 2023, I think it was the biggest year yet when it comes to the development of CCS and CCU policies, because in addition to what we've had in place for quite some time, like the CCS directive and the EU ETS directive, although under both of these there are already also CCS related new developments, we now have, as we mentioned, the proposal for Net Zero Industry Act that has much stronger and CCS specific policy goals than we've seen so far. But also the fact that we have more than 70 European CCUS projects that are looking to become operational within the next 5 to 7 years. We're just in a completely different reality in terms of the pipeline of projects and the developments on the policy landscape. So it's looking great so far. Obviously, you mentioned several other developments also that we will dig in deeper during our session today. But I'm very, very optimistic. And given that ZEP is one of the leading organizations in Brussels in this field, we have a lot to do to make sure that we do our most for the CCUS deployment in Europe.
Okay. Thank you, Eva, and we will hear from this obviously in this hour. Then I will go to Meindert van der Spek. He is an associate professor at Heriot-Watt University, and I also have to look into my notes to name the department right. It's the School of Engineering and Physical Science in the Institute of Mechanical and Energy Process Engineering. But I think the most important part is that you are a member of the Research Center for Carbon Solutions, the RCCS of Heriot-Watt, doing research on CCS. And also for you, a starting question coming from a more scientific point of view and knowing that CCUS plays a big role in our climate goals. Can technology provide the solutions at this point already?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think technology was able to do that a decade ago or probably even longer. I think about 10 years ago, we saw a first wave of CCS projects being implemented. I think of Boundary Dam of Petronova in the Middle East also. And then it became quiet for a little while. But now we see also in Europe, but in many other countries as well, that implementation is picking up speed again. So yes, the technologies are definitely there. That doesn't mean that all the that everything is ironed out. So R&D will continue. We will also continue to develop new technologies, but I mean, you see a very big shift from early phase R&D to implementation at large scale, because that's what we need to do. And we should have done it much earlier. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but at least we're doing it now.
Yes, thank you, Minded. That's sort of a feeling that there was a bit of a delay of a couple of years due to several causes, like carbon prices, like societal awareness wishes with big projects earlier this century. Last in our panel, by the way, I need to mention Minded also plays a big role in our project ConsenCUS for the net zero modeling and for the help in developing our innovation, which I will explain much later. Sorry, Luciana working for the Energy Policy Group, where she is head of clean industry. And your main research interests are industrial decarbonization, climate policies, and public perception of decarbonization technologies. You were educated and trained as environmental scientist at the University of Edinburgh and did your PhD also in the UK, in London, so to say. And also a question for you, Luciana. Can we or can industries avoid talking about CCUS?
Thanks very much, Dirk, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. As Dirk mentioned, I'm head of clean economy at Energy Policy Group, and we do deal a lot with industry. And to that question, can industries avoid talking about CCS? Some of them can, because CCS is not applicable everywhere. It must be applied where it makes the most sense for industries to decarbonize. But when we look at specific industries, for example, the cement and lime production industry, as well as chemicals, including fertilizers, we do see that CCS needs to be a core part of their decarbonization portfolios. And these industries in particular cannot avoid talking about CCS, especially with, as Yves mentioned, the revision of the ETS directive does come with a pretty rapid phase out of the free allowances that these industries have been benefiting from. So the urgency for them is ever growing. I will say that as EPG, we work in Central and Eastern Europe, and from here, industries are actually pushing for CCS. So I would say that the question is not just can industries avoid talking about CCS, it's also governments, because in Central and Eastern Europe, very often this is where the bottleneck is. So yes, absolutely, there is an urgency to get CCS onto the agenda of governments and for industries to be able to deploy it.
Okay, I think we will touch upon the subject of how governments pick up this and should, so to say, we should elaborate more on this. First, I want to give a short glimpse in the ConsenCUS project. This Horizon 2020 funded project started in 2021. May 2021, which gives us now over 2 years of designing, developing, constructing our innovation, which is a novel technique, an innovative technique to capture carbon with only electricity. So electrochemical capture of carbon out of flue gases from industries. But with an additional step that we also convert this carbon that we capture electrochemically again to useful products. And in this case, we convert it to potassium formate, which gives the right range for other products to use. Well, the novelty of our technique, of course, can fill up a whole webinar in itself. So we're not going to talk about this. We're going to highlight now some of our project characteristics. That is that we want to demonstrate this technique in several industries, 3 different industries. But alongside, we're also designing the CO2, the carbon value chains and net zero industrial cluster around these industries. This will be a lot of modeling. This will also be a lot of assumptions because, well, that's also the goal of this webinar, to find out what is there already with regard to transportation of carbon, with regard to large facilities that can convert and can use carbon.
Apologies. Can I just ask everyone to mute themselves because participants are saying that there's a noise in the background. I have also heard it. I also hear typing every now and then. So if we can make sure that all the speakers are muted, and I guess participants are muted anyway.
Yeah, so maybe...
Yes, and the noise disappeared. Perfect, thank you.
It's the echo of your computer maybe minded, but that's... yes. Thank you, Eva, for this interruption. Designing net zero industrial clusters when using electricity as a source for capturing gives us an intermittency, of course. When we use renewable electricity, that's not always available, or it's available in abundance. And to level this out, maybe also we need to store temporarily carbon into injection wells and use it again afterwards. So this is also modeled in our project. Project consists of 19 partners, ranging from, of course, the scientific partners, from SMEs with the innovation and partners from public bodies. And this is the timeline already mentioned. We are now in year 3 and we are building up to our first demonstration. Actually, this is going to be installed beginning of November this year. And this is our geographical dispersion. It's starting in Aalborg, Portland. That is a big cement factory in Denmark. And that is also the centerpiece of our Northwestern industrial cluster research and modeling. And later on in the project, after testing and research in Denmark, we are also going to our southern eastern industrial cluster, where there are 2 locations, a refinery in Romania and a magnesium mine in Greece. Also here, our technique will be tested and will be researched and will be evaluated against the efficiency of operating in these different industrial places. And why these industries? I think this is a bridge to what we're going to discuss. Well, there are industries who have hard to abate emissions. They're at the top of the emitters list, but it's not simply just changing their resources to carbon-free or carbon-neutral resources, because some of the processes have process-specific emissions. For example, the cement industry or the magnesium industry. All the while, they are crucial industries for the European economy. Well, these industries are very willing to invest in pilots for demonstrations and decarbonizations. And that gives us a chance to operate our innovation in 3 different use cases, and we can formulate 3 different CO2 value chain models and business cases. Doing this research in the first 2 years also gained some insights into the state of play of CCUS policies, of course, and that's why we drafted a first policy letter. And I will now give the floor to Lucian to highlight some of these recommendations we have formulated in this first consensus policy letter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dirk. So as mentioned, within one of the work packages, work package 9 of the consensus project, our role as EPG is to translate the findings of the consensus project into actionable policy recommendations. And there are some policy recommendations that we're all very much aware of, the challenges that CCUS faces for large-scale deployment around lack of regulation and appropriate financing, the low availability of infrastructure, and low public awareness. What we tried to do in this policy letter was to highlight some slightly more specific considerations that we think policymakers should be aware of as they're designing the next phase of CCUS policy for the EU and also at national level. So we came up with 7 policy recommendations based on the findings of the project and also inputs from the project consortium. The first one is around the environmental implications of CO2 capture technologies, which should be appropriately assessed, and we should be prioritizing environmentally benign and resource efficient technologies for capturing CO2. The second consideration is that there are trade-offs when it comes to CO2 capture technologies between performance and resource consumption, and these should be accounted for. And we should really be looking at incentivizing research, development, and deployment to optimize the capture technologies from this point of view. The third recommendation is that when we talk about CCUS technologies looking towards the future of their deployment, they all need to be fit for operation in a net zero world. And what this means is that full chain CCUS needs to be looked at from a life cycle perspective. We need to ensure that where we apply CCUS, the contribution to climate mitigation is actually a positive one, because CCUS does come with energy consumption, it does come with infrastructure build out and all the resource use that comes with that. So we do need to be quite careful and quite precise when assessing the life cycle impact of, especially if we're talking about large scale rollout of CCUS across Europe. There's another set of policy recommendations which have more to do with actual implementation of CCUS. The first one is that we're seeing potential demand for carbon capture coming from emitters of all shapes and sizes and different activity types and different locations. We see a lot of demand potentially coming in for carbon capture from emitters that can be quite isolated. We have cement production plants that tend to be sited close to the resources, the primary raw materials, so limestone quarries, which are not necessarily part of industrial clusters. And the idea is that modular and scalable CO2 capture technologies need to be developed so that these can be retrofitted to emitters that are not necessarily part of industrial clusters and might not benefit from sort of shared infrastructure that develops around these clusters. Further down the value chain, there's another consideration around transport and storage for which we need harmonized standards, especially when we talk about CO2 transport. There's a need for standards around CO2 temperature, purity, pressure, and so on. And when it comes to storage infrastructure, this must be implemented sort of where it makes the most sense and optimal locations and well researched from the point of view of the geology of the subsurface. And the final recommendation within this sort of pack of recommendations is that we absolutely need more research development, but crucially, Meindert was the one that pointed this out when we were drafting the policy letter, deployment. We're not just talking about R&D. There are technologies that have been researched, that have been proven to be functioning well over a decade ago, and we do need to deploy these in order to gain the knowledge from commercial scale deployment that will enable costs to come down and the rollout to speed up. We also need to be looking to scale best-in-class CCUS technologies. And on the sort of government side, how do we make this happen? We need to come up with comprehensive strategies for funding R&D, innovation, and demonstration, especially at national level, which is where member states hold a lot of power. And the final recommendation is around an issue that is coming up more and more in the CCUS discussion, which is one of public perception and community engagement. So one recommendation that we make is that the meaningful engagement of communities and stakeholders in CCUS projects must be prioritized. And this goes beyond just informing the public. We need to look at capability building activities, which can help generate valuable insights also for the project developers from local stakeholders. So it's really a two-way street. Project developers engaging local communities around CCS sites to make sure that the deployment of CCS is a cooperation, but also the project developers can gain useful insights about a particular site if they engage the communities early on. So these are all summarized in the policy letter and expanded on in the policy letter, which is available on the project website. I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure we can pick up on some of these recommendations along the discussion, and I'll pass it back to you, Dirk. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciana. Yeah, and I want to directly go to Eva again, because, with the short introduction of consensus and this policy letter and also the things we had in our introduction, CCUS is a very octopusy-like subject, so to say. We have utilization, storage, networks, emerging technologies, different countries. Where does CEP want to act first, or could you elaborate on the work CEP is now doing to try to make this a comprehensive and a good debate on how to get CCUS started?
Thank you. I will start with a few words about ZEP. I mean, you mentioned some already in the introduction, but we are an advisor to the European Union on the deployment of CCS and CCU. So we are a trusted advisor, but also basically a go-to organization to liaise with the European institution. And we also have good cooperation with member state governments. We have a government group attached to ZEP, where we have more than 20 governments convening in meetings and discussing and sharing information about CCS. Our membership base is quite broad. It ranges from oil and gas companies to industry, utilities, research, trade unions, equipment suppliers, and environmental NGOs. So in that sense, we are bringing together very wide sets of CCS expertise and also outlook of where we need to go. So the organization itself has been around for almost 20 years now. So we've seen the CCS come and then kind of go, and now having a very, very strong comeback. And we are, as an organization, stronger than ever thanks to growing membership. We just welcomed new members, for example, last week at the Advisory Council meeting. And the way we operate is also reflecting the realities of what is happening in the policy fields in Brussels, and in Europe more broadly. Because originally ZEP was mostly focusing on research and innovation. But I would say these days that very technical work is maybe 30% of what we do. And our policy advocacy is 70% of what we do, because nowadays it's not that much anymore about research and development, although that is still important, but it's really about getting the projects deployed and getting the right policy conditions out there and getting those conditions right. One of the very exciting new tools we have that should help with that is a new projects network, where we will have projects, basically either those who are already further ahead or those who are still in the planning phases. So different CCUS projects coming together and promoting then this large-scale deployment throughout Europe. Some of the areas that we're looking at are de-risking projects, both financial and technical de-risking issues. Also looking at supply and demand of CO2. So I'm mentioning this projects network because there is currently nothing like this in the overall European setting. We have had some initiatives that are looking on certain countries, but there is nothing that is pan-European. Then in the network, we'll also look at accelerating projects, so making sure that it's possible to reduce the development timeline, which is one of the challenges, right? CCS projects do have long lead times. Obviously, best practices on stakeholder management and also stakeholder engagement, community engagement, public perception areas. So all of this comes up. But when we look at the policy space in general, there is a lot happening there, and obviously, to certain extent, in order to have impacts, we need to prioritize. But at the same time, as an organization with a growing membership, we also have this opportunity to, as the field of CCS is growing, we can grow with it so that we are able to serve our members, we are able to serve the policymakers, we are able to serve the wider set of stakeholders. I think I'm not going to go into the specific policy tools right now, but I'll keep it at this.
Thank you, Ebbe, for this highlight. Minded, also a question for you. Now we've learned that there is a lot of R&D progress. It's not even the important part of the SEP anymore, although we need to develop new techniques. But we need to implement these techniques in a net zero framework. Could you elaborate a bit more on that? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and people have been flapping around the word net zero a lot, and many countries have net zero targets or pledges for 2050 or even for 2045, some for 2060, and it's not always 100% clear what that means, but what it means in terms of climate change is that basically we don't emit any more CO2 than that we effectively also remove out of the atmosphere. So on a net basis, we don't emit any CO2 and preferably any greenhouse gas, right? Because there are also greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide, and you know that's not very far away. We're in 2023 now. The EU and many EU member states have targets for net zero in 2050. So that really means that any technology that you install now should be able to function in that net zero world, because otherwise it becomes obsolete. And typically, I've already mentioned it briefly, but you know, the deployment of technology doesn't always go that quickly. A project has a very long lead time, and that means that we're basically one or perhaps two investment rounds away from 2050. So it's very likely that technologies that are being deployed now will come to see a world where we need to operate at net zero. And that basically means that CO2 capture plants, for instance, they need to capture more CO2 than you know we previously always assumed. We had this kind of arbitrary 90% capture efficiency, and you know I say arbitrary because it seemed in the early 2000s that seemed to strike a good balance between how much CO2 you can capture and how much CO2 you avoid then from the operations of a power plant or an industrial plant, and the energy required to capture that CO2. But you know we see countries moving now more, and not only countries but also technology providers and R&D moving much more towards the capture of 100% CO2. Equally, and this is also important to understand, if you take a CO2 molecule and you convert that into something, which in principle is a very good idea, but if that something is a short-lived product that is combusted again, for instance, a year down the line, let's for simplicity's sake say a fuel. If that CO2 has a fossil origin, so it comes originally from a fossil-fired power plant or a fossil-fired manufacturing plant, and you combust it again, that's not net zero because you're still emitting fossil CO2. So these are considerations that are really important to keep in mind for companies, but also for governments when designing policies and when designing their decarbonization strategies. Because if you don't want to come in a situation, at least if I were a company, I wouldn't want to come into a situation where I invest now in a plant that is basically obsolete in 10 years from now.
Thank you, Minded, for highlighting this. We now can move over to some of the specific recommendations in our policy letter and discuss them with the panel, but I also want to invite our guests and listeners that if there is a question, please send it in the public chat to us, and so we can pick it on. So to summarize, a lot is going on. It's gaining momentum, and going back to you, Meindert, one of the recommendations is that CCUS pathways must be fit for operation in a net zero world. But what can the policies then do? You ended with different policies from governments, etc. But is it like stating harsh goals of in 2050 it is emitting zero carbon? Is it, well, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I mean, the targets are clear. So, I mean, and they have been clear for a couple of years now, and especially in the EU, it's actually grand that we, that the EU can operate as such a bloc, because that means that many economies that all emit CO2, obviously, or greenhouse gases, move together in the same direction. I think. But one of the most important things that governments need to do is set out the rules very clearly, but also allowing, how should I say that? Reducing the risk for companies. So they need to, companies need to know what they can expect, basically, because it's very difficult to invest in an environment of changing policy. And the risk for Europe a little bit is that if these policies aren't very clear, and if the risk is not mitigated for companies, then they may just shut down business at some point. If for instance the ETS price would continue to go up, but they don't have clarity on targets, then they may simply cease to produce in the EU. I think one other thing that is really very important is the access to the CO2 transport and storage, and it's not, you cannot expect of each individual CO2 emitter, and perhaps especially the smaller ones, or let's say the mid-sized ones, to be able to develop their own CO2 transport and storage, right?
Yes.
For cement is a very good example, because the cement production inherently emits CO2, and I think there's nobody that's going to say that in 2050 we don't need cement anymore, even if we transition to more use of different building materials.
Okay.
Cement plants are also very dispersed across countries, and they're indeed very close to quarries, because that made sense traditionally, because they want to be where their feedstock is. So they need to be given access to CO2 transport and storage modalities, because they don't really have another option to decarbonize, and that is the case for a number of different industries. And so getting CO2 transport publicly accessible in place, or publicly accessible to different companies, that is one of the key things, because, and again, that's also part of the de-risking. Without that, companies cannot move.
Okay, thank you, Meindert. Eva, I wanted to ask you, stating on this discussion on different member states, you have EU policies. In an ideal world for you, would there be one European legislation, or should member states be more active on this CCUS policies and the goals, and setting the boundaries for the deployment of CCUS technologies? What would you choose?
Well, this is not really either or, it's an and concept for sure, because we have a strategy, for example, the industrial carbon management strategy coming up towards, in a few months, setting plans on the EU level. We have the EU's 2040 climate target proposal coming up in the Q1 of next year, again setting targets on EU level. Hopefully there's going to be something specific there also on carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and utilization. So we do need guidance on EU level, but we also need member states to set their own targets. And ZEP has specifically been asking for both 2030 and 2040 targets for CCS and CCU on EU level and on member state level. I mean, obviously, specifically on member states that have the conditions to deploy these projects, and on member states level, of course, how they reflect these technologies in their national energy and climate plans is crucial. But then there are some parts that are broader. Meinrad already mentioned transportation. We need to have an EU level plan, and I think that's where the industrial carbon management strategy is well suited to help to lay that out. We need broader plan that could then be implemented locally. It's not possible to build it all up starting only from the member state level, because the challenge in the EU in these situations could be that you end up with a patchwork that doesn't really match all over. So depending on the specific part of the value chain, we might need more EU level action or more member state focus. But all in all, it all has to come together and make sense and help get the projects deployed.
Yeah, thank you. There is a specific question to you in the chat. It's from Jesper Sant Damtoft. How do you view the framework of CCUS for entities emitting mixed fossil fuels and biogenic CO2? There will be no ETS savings by storing the biogenic part. Will there be a way of valorizing this?
So this is an area that I understand currently DG Klima is seriously looking into, because we are getting more and more discussions. Because if you look at the whole CCUS value chain, and it's not only about CCUS from industry, it's also bioenergy with CCS, it's also direct air capture with CCS. And hence we have industrial carbon management strategy coming up that should cover all of these, right? And we do have this challenge right now that the EU ETS doesn't incentivize really storing the biogenic parts. And I would say watch out for this space, because there should be some more clarity. First of all, how exactly will the different types of CO2, the biogenic and fossil, be monitored throughout the value chain? And then also whether there will be a chance to valorize the biogenic CO2, which might be something that comes up actually in 2026, when the European Commission is supposed to publish reports on how to include carbon dioxide removal in the EU ETS. Another important report to watch out for.
2026, and this will be preceded with public consultations?
For sure. I would assume so, because I know that stakeholders are already knocking behind Commission's doors and trying to get messages and concepts and principles delivered. So the work already is going on. The question is whether it's going to be just a report or whether there is actually going to be a legislative proposal. Because when it comes to proposals, then obviously we will go through the whole, better regulation sequence of public consultation and so on. Let's see. I guess it's slightly too early to tell. Even the Commission is not really. They themselves probably don't know yet exactly what shape it will take, because there's still quite a few years until that point.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned also the transport part, and I think also Meinrad touched upon the transport part. What are to either Eva or Meinrad, what are the main issues now with transport? Is it the risk sharing or the quality of CO2 that you can inject, or just investing in the network? All things come to mind, but what is crucial to get this network going for the transport?
Should I start and Meinert to add?
Yeah.
Okay, let's do it this way. So from ZEP's perspective, the whole having the CO2 transport network across Europe is something that should be the main focus of the industrial carbon management strategy that we should see hopefully in November. So what we really need to have is a regulatory framework for the CO2 transports that would then guarantee that the network that we will end up with is non-discriminatory, it is open access, it is cross-border. As I mentioned, Europe is a union of so many small countries. So we need to have this infrastructure in place in a coordinated fashion, because we will be transporting millions of tons of CO2 across Europe. And indeed, as Lucian already mentioned, one of the challenges is the CO2 quality standards for the infrastructure access. So the aspects around temperature, purity. There is a report that is not publicly yet available that comes from the CCUS Forum Working Group on CO2 infrastructure, which also has been co-chaired by ZEP among IOGP and Bellona. And there are recommendations in that report on how to tackle the CO2 specifications aspect. But indeed, also the question around business models and how to make this work in practice. We need to solve this.
Mine, do you?
Yes. So building out the CO2 transport system is extremely complex, and the reason for that is partially because of the chicken and egg problem, right? So investments need to be made for an infrastructure that is not going to be used at full scale yet. So basically, because you need to allow CO2 emitters to tie into that network. And in 2016 in the UK, there was the Lord Oxborough report, which very clearly took a position there and said the government needs to do that very similar to how many governments in the 60s, 70s, 80s in Europe have developed their natural gas transport lines, because they felt there was not, that couldn't be left to private entities. Now, the funny thing is that the CO2 transport that we see developed at the moment, so for instance, Portos in Rotterdam or in the United Kingdom, they are actually built by consortia of private parties, but with strong government backing. And the reason for that is because they are more point-to-point transport networks. So they go from one industrial cluster to one CO2 storage location on the North Sea, for instance. So that seems to go against this Lord Oxborough advice. I do still think that this may make sense for clusters that are very close to storage locations. But if we're talking about decarbonizing industry in the whole of Europe, then I don't think this is going to work. So I do think it's very strong government direction is needed there, if not ownership or maybe in terms of a public-private partnership or something like that.
Public ownership, socializing the network, so to say. Okay, thank you. Meinert, there was a follow-up question, and of course there's a bit of delay in answering and then typing. So thank you, Jesper, for engaging with us, and to all others, of course. If there is something you want to know or you need to know, please ask our experienced panelists. But there is a question of the biogenic CO2. Could the value be so high that it hampers the use of CO2?
Yeah, thanks, Jesper. That's a very interesting question indeed, isn't it? We don't know. And at the moment, the funny thing is that the price that people are willing to pay for carbon removals, because taking a biogenic CO2 molecule and storing that permanently underground is a form of carbon dioxide removal from the air. So at the moment, the prices paid for that are extremely low, and it can also be extremely high. So it really depends on what the buyer is willing to pay for that, and that is because they are completely private markets at the moment. So there are no government schemes for carbon dioxide removal, and that nicely makes a bridge to one of my hobby horses, which I think it is fantastic that there are private schemes. And that there are private companies that buy carbon dioxide removals at the same time to really scale that, because we also need to scale that to reach net zero. We need compliance markets, and that means again that governments, be it the EU or at national level or America, UK, whatever, they need to come with schemes that pay or that give an incentive to remove CO2 from the air, in addition to ETS that we currently have, right? Because we still need to avoid or mitigate current emissions of CO2.
Thank you. Then another question from the chat. Why is the CO2 mostly transported to the North Sea? I'm looking at the panel. This was not something in the preparation, but maybe Eva can give it a go.
Well, I guess the easy answer is that's where we have the most developed storage sites in Europe to date. But of course, what we're hoping and what we're seeing is that is bound to change. We had the best storage reserves under the North Sea, so it will always be, I think, the most important in terms of the scale of storage there. But it doesn't make sense to transport CO2 from all over Europe to the North Sea. We have other sites in Europe that also have storage potential. They're also being explored. We have some are offshore, some are onshore. I mean, onshore is I would say less common these days. But yeah, that is the reason. Maybe adding to Mindert's answer to Jesper's question on the biogenic CO2 and what if the value is so high that it hampers the use of the CO2 in fuels. I think it is a tricky question, because on one side we do need carbon dioxide removal, so we need to be able to store away very durably or permanently large amounts of biogenic CO2, just to be able to balance those residual emissions from hard to abate sectors. But yes, indeed, there is also going to be a demand for the CO2 for fuels. And now the question is, where do you draw the line? How much of what would you need to do? In general, I think my understanding is that the thinking is, and here I don't think ZEP has developed a position, so it's rather a personal reflection, is that we do need gigatons of carbon removal, and quite a substantial part of it would be this is more durable carbon removal, specifically as we reach 2050 and go beyond. And the potential to use CO2, I don't think it's in the same level of volumes. So eventually, I think there will be less CO2 used and more stored away, because we need to be able to balance those residual emissions. Otherwise, there is no net zero, right? And then no net negative afterwards.
Thank you for this addition. Then maybe a question to Luciana, because you also in the southeastern part of Europe, you see a lot of projects around point-to-point sources. The project of common interest from Bulgaria and also a storage site is now going underway, right?
Absolutely. Just to clarify, it's not PCI just yet. It's received funding from the Innovation Fund. But to Amin's question around the North Sea, indeed, that's where our storage is most developed. But we are seeing emerging storage sites offshore in the Mediterranean Sea. So you have the Ravenna hub that's being developed by Italy. Indeed, in the Black Sea, we've got the first storage site being explored as part of this project called ANRAV CCS, which is indeed point-to-point capture from one of Heidelberg Materials cement plants in Bulgaria and transport for storage in an offshore depleted gas field. I think that we're really in quite early stages, at least in Central and Eastern Europe, in terms of, again, the government prioritization of CCS. And this is really, I think, the roots of the slow development of CCS in these regions. So you have legal frameworks that still restrict or even ban CO2 storage. You have legal frameworks that are in place but are not up to date. So Romania transposed the CCS directive in 2011 when it had an attempt at a demonstrator project with onshore storage. But the secondary legislation on procedures for transport of CO2 never followed. So I think there was a point maybe from Mindert at the beginning about the need for clear policy, like very clear targets, but also a regulatory framework that's fit for purpose to enable transport and storage to be developed in whatever form that happens. So it's promising. We are seeing a lot of projects emerge. CO2 capture is happening on a demonstrator scale in Poland. We have had applications to innovation funds from a range of countries in the CEE region. Croatia, I would want to highlight as a country. It's quite interesting because they have a lot going on, so to say, in terms of CCS. They're obviously trying to link to the Ravenna hub for offshore storage, but they also have a plan for a CCS project with onshore storage, again from a cement plant, which is something that, as Eva was mentioned, is a bit less common these days. And I think a large part of that is maybe a subject we'll touch on in the closing, is the sort of public perception of onshore storage and the difficulties that comes with, and historically opposition to onshore storage. But Croatia is one country that I would watch closely because they are moving fast when it comes to CCS, at least relative to the pace in Central and Eastern Europe.
Thank you, Luciana. And as I look at the timer, it's almost nearing 10 o'clock, and we have to wrap up this meeting. To my feeling, we had a good discussion, and we just lifted up the curtain a little bit and saw that there is a lot of CCUS work to be done, but also is going on at the end of. Is going on behind this curtain. There's a lot of work being done by SEP. I surely recommend also visiting the website of Zero Emission Platform, and of course look where you can engage or where you can be part of public outreach from the EU or a call of evidence, etc. In the chat, there are some comments. Remember to enter CCUS Forum 27-28 of November in Aalborg. ConsenCUS will be highlighted. That's nice. That's also a nice bridge, Jesper, to my last slide to show you. That is, oh, sorry, that last slide didn't come through. But I wanted to highlight, of course, that we are starting with Jesper in Aalborg, Portland, the first demonstration of our demonstration plant at the cement factory from the 1st of November. And luckily, we can have the CCUS forum also over there. So that is very nice. To the question of Amin, when is the next seminar? Well, we are drawing up new conclusions and new policy advice after our demonstration cycle, so in the beginning of 2025. So that's a bit more patience needed. But of course, then we will draw up conclusions of the ConsenCUS project, and we have a new policy recommendations available, which we will also present in our final conference, and that will be the first quarter of 2025 when we end our project. I really like to thank our panelists at this moment, Meinert from the Harriet Watt University, Eva Thelma from the Zero Emission Platform, and Luciana Miu, who wrote our policy recommendations from Energy Policy Group. And with this, I want to close this conference. Thank you, Amin, for this last nice shout out. Okay, thank you. I will look at my colleague. Can you
Thank you.
close the seminar?
Thank you, everyone.